Garrett Callahan built a logistics empire on one rule: trust nothing you cannot control. Contracts, schedules, data. Never people. His ex-wife proved that. The custody battle carved it into bone. So when a highway pileup made him miss the most important flight of his career, he sat in that airport terminal calculating losses, not feeling them. That was when he noticed her. A young woman sitting alone in the corner. No luggage, no phone, watching the departure board like it owed her something. He walked over and offered money. She refused. She did not want charity. She wanted to borrow his car, just for a few hours, just to get home. Garrett Callahan, the man who verified everything twice, looked into the eyes of a stranger and handed over his keys without asking a single question, at precisely 8:45 every morning. Garrett Callahan walked through the glass doors of Callahan Logistics headquarters with a coffee in his left hand and his phone in his right. He did not stop at the reception desk to make small talk. He did not pause to check the weather outside the lobby windows. He moved with the efficiency of a man who had calculated the exact number of steps between the parking garage and his private elevator, and who considered any deviation from that path a waste of resources. His employees knew better than to interrupt him during this transition. They nodded respectfully as he passed, and he acknowledged them with the briefest dip of his chin, a gesture so small it barely qualified as human contact. The conference room on the 42nd floor of Callahan Logistics headquarters had floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city like a promise kept. Garrett stood at the head of the mahogany table, his posture straight, his charcoal suit pressed to perfection, watching 12 board members hang on his every word. The quarterly report glowed on the screen behind him, green arrows pointing upward, numbers climbing like they were afraid to disappoint him. He spoke in measured tones about expansion into the Midwest corridor, about fuel efficiency metrics, about a contract with Henderson Global that would double their freight capacity within 18 months. His voice never wavered. His hands never gestured unnecessarily. Every syllable had been rehearsed, every pause calculated to land with maximum impact. This was what Garrett did best. He controlled rooms the way conductors controlled orchestras, with invisible precision that made chaos look like harmony. After the meeting, his assistant Philip fell into step beside him in the hallway, rattling off the afternoon schedule. Flight to Denver at 4:15. Dinner with Henderson's CEO at 8. Breakfast meeting with the legal team at 7 the next morning to finalize contract language. Garrett nodded without looking up from his phone, scrolling through emails that required responses measured in minutes, not hours. His calendar was a fortress with no gaps, no room for the unexpected. He had built his life this way deliberately, brick by brick, after the divorce. After Meredith took their son to Portland and turned every phone call into a battlefield. After the custody hearings that bled him dry, not of money, but of something deeper, he learned then that people were variables he could not solve for. They changed. They lied. They left. So he stopped relying on them for anything that mattered. The car service was waiting downstairs, a black sedan with leather seats that smelled like money. Garrett climbed in and opened his laptop, reviewing the Henderson proposal one more time. The numbers were solid. The projections were conservative. The risk assessment had been triple-checked by his best analysts. Everything was in place. He allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction, not quite a smile, but something close. This deal would cement his legacy. This deal would prove that Garrett Callahan did not need luck or charm or connections. He only needed data, discipline, and the willingness to outwork everyone in the room. The driver merged onto the highway, and Garrett barely noticed the scenery blurring past. He was already 3 steps ahead, rehearsing his dinner conversation, anticipating objections, preparing counter-arguments. The future was a chess game, and he had memorized every possible move. Then the brake lights appeared, a wall of red stretching across all 4 lanes. Cars stopped dead like a photograph. The driver slowed, then stopped, then sighed. Garrett looked up from his laptop for the first time in 20 minutes. Ahead of them, maybe half a mile, he could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles, the distant silhouettes of people standing on the shoulder. An accident. A bad one, judging by the helicopter circling overhead. He checked his watch. 3:47. His flight was at 4:15. The airport was still 12 miles away. He opened his phone and pulled up the traffic app, watching the estimated delay climb from 15 minutes to 45 to over an hour. His jaw tightened. He called Philip. He called the airline. He called the car service dispatch to ask about alternate routes. But there were no alternate routes. There was only this highway, this traffic, this wall of metal and glass that did not care about his schedule or his contract or his carefully constructed life. By the time they reached the airport, it was 6:23. The Denver flight had left 2 hours ago. Garrett stood at the departure board, his carry-on beside him, his laptop bag over his shoulder, staring at the word, departed, like it was a personal insult. He had missed flights before, but never one that mattered this much. The dinner with Henderson was in 90 minutes. The contract was supposed to be signed tomorrow morning. He could feel the deal slipping through his fingers like sand, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He called Henderson's assistant to reschedule. He called his own team to run damage control. He booked the next available flight, a red-eye that would get him to Denver at 1 in the morning. Then he found a seat in the terminal, pulled out his laptop, and tried to work. But for the first time in years, the numbers on the screen meant nothing. They were just shapes, just pixels, just evidence of a plan that had failed, despite every precaution he had taken. The terminal was nearly empty at this hour, that strange liminal space between the last evening flights and the overnight departures. Garrett sat in a row of plastic chairs near gate B7, his coffee growing cold beside him, his eyes fixed on a spreadsheet he was not reading. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a flat, sterile glow that made the world feel slightly unreal. He thought about calling his son. It was only 8 o'clock in Portland, and Dylan would still be awake. But he did not know what he would say. Their conversations had become so careful, so polite, like two strangers making small talk at a bus stop. Meredith had won more than custody. She had won Dylan's ease, his comfort, his willingness to share the small details of his life. Garrett got the highlights, the report card summaries, the carefully edited version of a childhood he was missing. He put his phone away and stared at the departure board instead, watching the minutes tick by like a sentence being served. The accident had been worse than he thought. The news was playing on a television mounted near the food court, and Garrett caught fragments as he walked past. A tanker truck had jackknifed across the highway, causing a chain reaction that involved 17 vehicles. 3 people were in critical condition. The highway would be closed for another 6 hours, while crews cleared the wreckage and investigated the scene. He thought about those 3 people, strangers whose lives had intersected with his for a single catastrophic moment. They had been going somewhere, too. They had plans, schedules, people waiting for them. Now they were lying in hospital beds, their futures rewritten by a split second of physics they could not control. Garrett had spent his entire career eliminating variables, reducing risk, building systems that anticipated failure before it happened. But there was no algorithm for a jackknifed tanker. There was no contingency plan for the randomness of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He wandered through the terminal without purpose, past the closed shops and the darkened restaurants, past the gates where tomorrow's flights were already posted on the screens. His footsteps echoed in the empty corridors. He felt unmoored, a ship without an anchor, drifting in waters he had not charted. This was what he hated most about travel: the surrender of control, the dependence on systems he did not build and could not fix. At home, in his office, in the conference room on the 42nd floor, he was the master of his domain. Here, he was just another passenger, subject to weather and mechanical failures and the incompetence of others. He found himself standing in front of a window that overlooked the tarmac, watching a plane taxi toward the runway. Its lights blinked in the darkness, red and white, like a heartbeat. He wondered where it was going. He wondered if the people on board knew how lucky they were to be leaving. A janitor pushed a mop across the tile floor behind him, the wet squeak of the mop head the only sound in the terminal, besides the hum of the air conditioning. Garrett watched the man work for a moment, noticing the careful way he moved around obstacles, the efficiency of his circular motion. There was a kind of mastery there, a competence born of repetition. Garrett wondered how long the man had been doing this job. He wondered if the janitor had ever missed a flight, ever stood in an empty terminal feeling like the floor had dropped out beneath him. Probably not. People who mopped floors did not fly to Denver to sign contracts. They took buses and trains and drove their own cars to places that were close enough to reach without trusting airlines or weather or the chaos of highways. There was wisdom in that, Garrett thought. There was safety in keeping your world small enough to control. The terminal had a small chapel tucked between the restrooms and a storage closet, a non-denominational space with a few rows of chairs and a shelf of religious texts from various traditions. Garrett had walked past it 100 times without ever going in. Tonight, he stopped at the door and looked inside. The room was empty, lit only by a small lamp in the corner. He did not consider himself religious. He had stopped believing in anything he could not measure or verify. But there was something about the silence of that space, the way it seemed separate from the chaos outside, that pulled at him. He did not go in. He stood at the threshold for a long moment, then turned and walked away. Some doors were easier to keep closed. It was nearly 10 o'clock when he noticed her. He had found a seat near the windows, away from the few other stranded travelers scattered through the terminal, and he was pretending to read emails on his phone when something in his peripheral vision made him look up. A young woman was sitting on the floor in the corner near gate B12, her back against the wall, her knees pulled up to her chest. She was wearing a thin jacket that looked too light for the season, and jeans with a small tear at the knee. No purse, no carry-on, no phone in her hand. She was just sitting there, still as a photograph, watching the departure board with an expression that Garrett could not quite read. It was not desperation. It was not sadness. It was something closer to patience, the look of someone who had learned to wait without expecting anything to change. He told himself it was none of his business. He told himself that airports were full of people with stories he would never know, and that was fine. He returned his attention to his phone, scrolling through messages that suddenly seemed trivial. But his eyes kept drifting back to her. There was something about the way she held herself, straight and still, that did not match her circumstances. Homeless people usually had a certain restlessness, a constant scanning of their environment for threat or opportunity. This woman looked like she was exactly where she meant to be, even if that made no sense. Her hair was dark and tangled, like she had not brushed it in days, but her face was clean. Her hands, resting on her knees, were steady. She was young, maybe late 20s, with the kind of beauty that did not need makeup or good lighting to announce itself. Garrett looked away again, uncomfortable with his own attention. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. The woman did not move from her spot on the floor. She did not check a phone. She did not approach any of the other travelers. She just sat there, watching the board, waiting for something that Garrett could not identify. Finally, against every instinct that had served him well for 53 years, he stood up. He told himself he was just going to the restroom. He told himself he was stretching his legs. But when he walked past her, he stopped. She looked up at him with eyes that were neither afraid nor hopeful, just present, just watching. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a $100 bill. He held it out to her without a word. The bill was crisp and new, fresh from the ATM that morning. Garrett always carried cash for emergencies, a habit from his early days, when credit cards were not as reliable as they were now. He held the money between two fingers, the way you might offer a treat to a suspicious animal, trying not to seem threatening. He expected her to take it quickly, to stuff it in her pocket before he changed his mind. That was what homeless people did. That was what anyone in need would do when confronted with $100 and no strings attached. But she did not reach for it. She did not even glance at the bill. She kept her eyes on his face, studying him the way he might study a financial report, looking for the numbers that did not add up. She looked at the money, then at his face, then back at the money. A small smile crossed her lips, not grateful, but almost amused. She shook her head. "No, thank you," she said. Her voice was quiet but clear, with no tremor or hesitation. "I do not need money." Garrett stood there with his hand extended, feeling foolish. He was not used to having his generosity refused. He was not used to being wrong about what people wanted. He lowered his hand, but didn't walk away. "Then what do you need?" he asked. The question came out before he could stop it, more aggressive than he intended. She met his eyes, and for a moment something flickered across her face, a calculation, a decision being made. "I need to borrow your car," she said, "just for a few hours. I need to get home." The request was so unexpected that Garrett laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, more bark than humor. "You want to borrow my car?" he repeated. "A stranger in an airport at 10 o'clock at night wants to borrow my car." She did not flinch. She did not explain. She just watched him with those steady eyes, waiting for his answer. He should have walked away. He should have called security. He should have done any of the 1,000 reasonable things that a man in his position would do when confronted with such an absurd request. Instead, he heard himself asking where she needed to go. "About 2 hours north," she said. "There is someone I need to see. I can have it back here by morning." Garrett studied her face, looking for the tells that would reveal the con, the nervous glance, the rehearsed sincerity, the subtle desperation of someone running a scam. But there was nothing. Her expression was open and calm, like a lake on a windless day. She was not trying to convince him. She was not trying to manipulate him. She was simply stating what she needed and trusting him to decide. It was the trust that undid him. He had spent the last decade building walls against exactly this kind of vulnerability. He had learned, through pain and loss and expensive lawyers, that trust was a luxury he could not afford. And yet here was this woman. This stranger, with no leverage and no backup plan, trusting him to be something other than the careful, calculating man he had become. He thought about Dylan. He thought about the phone calls that never said what he meant. He thought about the way his son had stopped asking him to visit, stopped expecting him to show up for the things that mattered. He thought about the contract in Denver, the deal that would cement his legacy, the numbers that had meant everything until the traffic stopped and the plane left without him. What was he really afraid of losing? A car could be replaced. Insurance would cover theft. The worst-case scenario was paperwork and inconvenience. But the look on this woman's face, the quiet dignity of her asking, the strange peace that seemed to surround her despite her circumstances, that was something he could not calculate or predict or control. And maybe that was exactly why he needed to say yes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his keys. His rental car was in the short-term lot, a silver sedan that he had picked up that morning and would return tomorrow afternoon. He held the keys out to her, the same way he had held out the money, but this time she took them. Her fingers brushed his palm, cool and light, and she looked up at him with something that might have been gratitude, but felt more like recognition. "Row C," he said, "Space 47. She nodded and stood up, brushing off her jeans. She was taller than he expected, almost his height, and she moved with a grace that seemed impossible given her apparent circumstances. "Thank you," she said. It was not effusive. It was not emotional. It was just a fact. Offered and received. "I will bring it back by 6 in the morning." Then she walked away, and Garrett watched her disappear through the terminal doors toward the parking structure. He stood there for a long moment, his hand still extended, his palm still feeling the ghost of her touch. What had he just done? He could not explain it to himself, let alone to anyone else. He had given his car to a homeless woman he had never met, based on nothing but a feeling he could not name. It was the most irrational decision he had made in 30 years of rational decisions. He should call the police. He should report the car stolen. He should do something to undo this moment of madness before it cost him more than he could afford. Instead, he walked back to his seat and sat down. His laptop was still open, the spreadsheet still glowing on the screen. But he did not look at it. He looked at the window, at the darkness beyond the glass, at the lights of planes taking off and landing in the distance. He thought about the woman, wherever she was now, driving his car north toward someone she needed to see. Who was it? A child? A parent? A lover? He would never know. That was the strange bargain he had made. He had given her something without any expectation of understanding, without any demand for explanation. It was the opposite of everything he believed. It was the opposite of everything he was. The clock on the wall showed 10:47. She had been gone for 40 minutes. Garrett tried to remember the last time he had trusted someone without verification, without a contract, without some form of collateral. He could not. Even his marriage had come with a prenuptial agreement. A document Meredith had signed without complaint, but which she threw in his face during the divorce proceedings. "You never really believed in us," she had said. "You always had one foot out the door." He had wanted to argue, to defend himself, to explain that the prenup was just prudent planning, nothing personal. But he could not, because she was right. He had never fully committed to anything that could not be measured or controlled. He had never let himself be vulnerable to the possibility of loss. The minutes crawled by. He tried to read. He tried to sleep. He tried to work on the presentation he would give to Henderson when he finally arrived in Denver. But his mind kept returning to the keys in her hand, the calm certainty of her voice, the way she had walked away without looking back. What if she did not return? What if this was all an elaborate con and he was the fool who had fallen for it? He could see the headline now. CEO loses rental car to airport scammer. His competitors would laugh. His board members would question his judgment. Philip would look at him with that particular expression of disappointed patience that he reserved for Garrett's rare lapses. And yet, even as he imagined the worst, something in him refused to regret. The decision had been made. The keys had been handed over. Whatever happened next was beyond his control. At midnight, he called Philip and told him to reschedule the Denver trip by one day. There was a silence on the other end of the line, the sound of a man choosing his words carefully. "Sir," Philip said finally, "is everything all right?" Garrett did not know how to answer. Everything was not all right. Everything was uncertain and strange and completely outside the parameters of his normal life. But he was not ready to explain that to anyone, least of all himself. "Just make the calls," he said. "I will be on the morning flight." He hung up before Philip could ask more questions. He must have fallen asleep at some point, because he woke to the sound of his phone buzzing. The terminal was still dark, still empty, the departure board showing flights that would not leave for hours. He checked the time. 5:47 in the morning. He checked his messages. Nothing important. Just the usual cascade of emails that accumulated overnight, like snow on a windshield. He stood up, his back aching from the plastic chair, and walked to the window. The sky was just beginning to lighten at the edges. That thin gray line between night and day that always made him think of endings and beginnings. At 6:12, she walked back through the terminal doors. She was moving slowly now, like someone who had been driving all night, but her face was different. Something had shifted behind her eyes, a weight lifted, or a question answered. She walked straight to where Garrett was standing and held out his keys. He took them without a word. The metal was warm from her hand. They stood there for a moment, not speaking, not needing to speak. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She held it out to him the same way he had held out the money, a gesture completed. "This is for you," she said. Then she turned and walked away, back toward the corner where he had first seen her. Garrett unfolded the paper. It was a letter, handwritten in small, careful script that covered both sides of the page. He read it standing there by the window, the morning light growing stronger behind him. She did not give her name. She did not explain who she had gone to see or why it mattered so much. But she told him what his decision had meant. She told him that she had not believed anyone would help her, that she had asked 7 other people before him, and they had all said no. She told him that the person she needed to see was dying, and that because of his car, she had made it in time to say goodbye. She told him that she did not know why he had trusted her, but that his trust had changed something in her, had reminded her that strangers could still be kind. She told him that she would never forget what he did. She told him, "Thank you." The letter was not long, maybe 300 words, but each sentence carried a weight that Garrett felt in his chest. She wrote about her grandmother, the woman who had raised her after her parents died, the woman who had taught her to cook and to pray and to believe that the world was fundamentally good, despite all evidence to the contrary. The grandmother had been sick for months, and the hospital had called to say she did not have much time left. The woman had no money for a bus ticket, no friends with cars, no way to get there except by asking strangers for help. 7 people had said no. Some had ignored her completely. One had threatened to call security. She had almost given up when she saw Garrett sitting alone by the window, a man in an expensive suit with an expression that looked like he was carrying something heavy. He read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his pocket, next to his wallet, next to the $100 bill she had refused. When he looked up, she was gone. The corner where she had been sitting was empty. He walked over to the spot, as if some trace of her might remain, but there was nothing. Just the same plastic chairs, the same fluorescent lights, the same departure boards cycling through flights he no longer needed to catch. He stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of the letter against his chest, feeling something else he could not name. It was not happiness exactly. It was not peace. It was more like a door opening somewhere deep inside him, a door he had locked so long ago that he had forgotten it existed. The flight to Denver was uneventful. The meetings were successful. Henderson signed the contract. And Garrett delivered the presentation he had rehearsed 100 times, hitting every mark, answering every question, demonstrating once again why Callahan Logistics was the best in the business. His team celebrated that night at an expensive restaurant, toasting to the future, to growth, to the numbers that would climb even higher in the quarters to come. Garrett raised his glass with them. He smiled when he was supposed to smile. He said the things that a CEO was supposed to say at moments like this. But something had shifted. The victory felt hollow, not bitter, but simply less important than it would have been a week ago. On the plane home, he took out the letter and read it again. He had read it so many times now that he knew every word by heart, but he still needed to see the handwriting. Still needed the physical proof that the night in the airport had really happened. The woman had not included her name or any way to contact her. She had given him this gift and then disappeared, asking nothing in return. It was the purest transaction he had ever been part of. No contracts, no negotiations, no leverage. Just need and trust and a set of car keys passed between strangers. He thought about what she had written, about the person she had gone to see. He thought about his own father, who had died 8 years ago while Garrett was in a meeting that could not be interrupted. He had gotten the call an hour too late, had flown home to a body already cold, had delivered a eulogy for a man he had not visited in months. That was the cost of control, the price of building walls so high that nothing could get in. But nothing could get out either. His grief had stayed locked inside him, calcifying into something hard and sharp that he carried everywhere without acknowledging. Maybe that was why the woman's request had broken through. Maybe some part of him remembered what it felt like to need desperately, to ask without expecting, to depend on the kindness of someone who had no reason to help. When he landed, he did not go to the office. He drove instead to a park near his apartment, a small green space with a pond and a walking path that he had never used. He sat on a bench and watched the ducks glide across the water, their movements effortless and calm. He thought about calling Dylan, not to report on his schedule or ask about grades, but just to talk, to ask what his son was interested in, to listen without an agenda. To be present in a way he had not been since the divorce turned everything into a competition. He pulled out his phone and stared at Dylan's name in his contacts. His finger hovered over the call button. Then he pressed it. The conversation was awkward at first. Dylan was surprised to hear from him on a random Tuesday afternoon, and Garrett could hear the wariness in his voice, the careful politeness of a child who had learned not to expect too much. But Garrett did not give up. He asked about Dylan's friends, about the video games he was playing, about the girl he had mentioned briefly in their last call. He listened. He laughed at the jokes he did not fully understand. He said, "I love you," before hanging up, something he had not done in longer than he wanted to admit. When the call ended, he sat on the bench for a long time, watching the ducks, feeling the letter in his pocket, feeling something inside him begin to thaw. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. Garrett did not quit his job, or sell his company, or move to a cabin in the woods. He still ran meetings, and reviewed contracts, and pushed his team to exceed their targets. He still believed in data, and discipline, and the importance of controlling what could be controlled. But he started leaving the office earlier. He started having lunch with colleagues instead of eating at his desk. He started noticing the people around him, the security guard who always said good morning, the barista who remembered his order, the administrative assistant who had worked for him for 3 years without ever being asked about her family. He learned their names. He learned their stories. He learned that trust was not a risk to be eliminated, but a bridge to be built, one small gesture at a time. He called Dylan every week now, not just on birthdays and holidays. Some calls were short, just a few minutes to check in. Others stretched into an hour, filled with the kind of rambling conversation that Garrett had never allowed himself before. He learned that his son was interested in marine biology, that he had a crush on a girl named Jade, who sat next to him in chemistry class, that he was thinking about applying to colleges on the East Coast, even though his mother wanted him to stay close to home. Garrett did not offer advice unless asked. He did not try to solve problems or optimize outcomes. He just listened, and in the listening, he found something he had not known he was missing. He found connection. He found presence. He found the simple joy of being known by someone he loved. The board members noticed the change, though they could not quite articulate what was different. Garrett still delivered results. He still ran efficient meetings and made tough decisions and held everyone to the highest standards. But there was something softer around the edges now, a willingness to pause and consider perspectives that did not fit neatly into spreadsheets. He started asking about people's families. He started remembering birthdays and anniversaries. He started saying thank you in a way that sounded like he actually meant it. Philip, his assistant, remarked one day that Garrett seemed happier. Garrett did not know if happy was the right word. Content, maybe. Or present. Or simply more alive than he had been in years. He visited Portland for Thanksgiving, the first time in 4 years. Meredith was polite but wary, watching him with the eyes of someone who expected disappointment. But Dylan was different. Dylan hugged him at the airport, a real hug, not the stiff half-embrace they had perfected over years of awkward visits. They went hiking in the Columbia River Gorge, just the two of them, and Garrett let his son set the pace. They talked about nothing important and everything important. They laughed at the same stupid jokes. At the end of the trip, Dylan asked if he could come stay with Garrett for part of the summer. Garrett said yes without checking his calendar first. He never saw the woman again. He never learned her name or what happened to her after that night in the airport. The letter stayed in his wallet, growing soft at the creases from being unfolded so many times. Sometimes he would take it out and read it, not because he needed to remember the words, but because he needed to remember the feeling of handing over his keys to a stranger, the feeling of trusting someone he had no reason to trust, the feeling of being changed by a single decision that made no logical sense. He had built an empire on certainty, on the belief that the future could be predicted and controlled. But the best thing he ever did was the one thing he could not explain. He had given his keys to a stranger, and she had given him back something he had lost so long ago he had forgotten its name. She had given him back the ability to believe in people, and that, in the end, was worth more than any contract he would ever sign. Sometimes, late at night when the office was empty and the city lights glittered below his window, Garrett would take out the letter and read it one more time. The paper was soft now, worn thin at the folds, but the words were still clear. "Thank you for trusting me," she had written. "Thank you for seeing me when everyone else looked away." He would trace her handwriting with his finger, wondering where she was now, hoping she had found whatever piece she was looking for. Then he would fold the letter carefully, put it back in his wallet, and go home. Because home was where the people he loved were waiting, and that was the only destination that mattered anymore.